You pull into the parking lot of a big box hardware store on a sticky July afternoon because your central air conditioning unit just started making that high-pitched metallic whine. It is the sound of an impending $1,200 repair bill. Inside, the aisles are packed with people pushing carts loaded with plastic window film kits, heavy-duty foam insulation rolls, and programmable thermostats that cost more than a good pair of leather boots. We have been taught to believe that comfort is something you buy in a shiny box, that a house built 40 or 50 years ago is fundamentally broken unless you spend thousands of dollars retrofitting it with modern synthetic materials. We look at a rising utility bill or a cold draft in January as a technical failure requiring a certified technician and a credit card stop. And think about that for a second. How did a 19th century farmhouse keep 3 generations of a family alley through winters that froze the town river solid, without a single wire running into the walls? They did not have access to synthetic fiberglass or smart climate control systems. Yet, when you walk into one of those old homesteads today, the air inside feels heavy, cool, and remarkably still, even when the blacktop outside is melting in the sun. They were using a completely different set of rules that were common knowledge during our grandfather's time, but were quietly set aside when energy became cheap and automated. I am not an engineer, and I do not have a degree in thermodynamics. What I have is 22 years of dust on my boots from walking through old barns, sitting at long pine kitchen tables in Lancaster and Holmes counties, and watching how traditional builders handle the transition of seasons. I have personally tested these methods on my own property, a modest home built in 1968, long before modern building codes dictated thick layers of chemical foam. And what I can tell you with absolute certainty is that the standard approach we are sold today, the endless cycle of buying specialized consumer goods to fix a draft or lower a cooling bill, is an expensive illusion. Now, let me be entirely honest with you about the limitations here. If your house was built after 2005 with engineered trusses, airtight synthetic wraps, and multi-pane argon-filled windows, what I am about to tell you will not change your life. Those houses are designed like sealed plastic bottles. They require mechanical lungs to breathe, and if you tamper with that equilibrium, you invite moisture and mold. But if your home was built between the end of the Second World War and the Carter administration, if it has solid wood framing, plaster, or early drywall, and standard double-hung windows that rattle slightly when the wind comes out of the north, then you are sitting on a structure that was designed to breathe. And because it was designed to breathe, you can regulate its temperature using traditional materials that cost less than a single morning's worth of specialty coffee. The first time the scale of this hit me, I was looking through a civilian supply document printed by the War Department in the winter of 1943. It was a thin, gray pamphlet titled the Emergency Household Conservation Manual, stamped with a declassification notice from 1961. It had been sitting in a box at the National Archives, largely ignored since the Eisenhower administration because the post-war building boom made its advice seem obsolete. The government was trying to figure out how to keep older, uninsulated suburban homes habitable if the coal and heating oil supply chains collapsed during the war. In that document, there was a section dedicated entirely to a substance that you can still find in the craft aisle of almost any grocery store or warehouse outlet today for about 95 cents a block. Plain, refined paraffin wax. When you see a block of it sitting on a shelf, it looks completely unremarkable. It is a dense, white solid, slightly oily to the touch, with no real smell to it. If you drop it on a concrete floor, it thuds with a dull, heavy sound. Most people pass right by it, assuming it is only useful for grandmother's jam jars or making homemade candles. But the old-timers knew better. They understood that paraffin is not just fuel. It is a stable, hydrophobic barrier that can transform common textiles into something completely different. In the old order communities, They call it weather cloth or oilcloth, and it has been used to stabilize the microclimate of old houses since the late 19th century. Understand this. The air in an older home moves like water. It enters through the lowest points on the windward side of the building, warms up as it absorbs the heat of the house, and escapes through the highest points on the opposite side. This is called the chimney effect, or convective looping. Modern weatherization attempts to stop this movement entirely by sealing every crack with sticky polyurethane foam. The problem is that when you stop the air completely in an old house, you trap the humidity, and the wood begins to rot from the inside out. The traditional solution did not try to kill the airflow. It sought to guide it, using a material that could expand and contract with the natural shifting of a wooden structure. By saturating a simple piece of loose weave cotton fabric, like an old bedsheet you were planning to throw away, with melted paraffin, you create a pliable, breathable seal. When you tuck a strip of this treated cloth into the gaps around an old window sash, the wax acts as a mechanical brake for the wind. It blocks the cold drafts completely. Yet it allows microscopic amounts of water vapor to pass through so your walls stay dry. A study conducted by the Pennsylvania State University Extension Service back in 1979 actually went back and measured this exact technique, referencing the old 1943 wartime manual. They found that in homes built before 1980, treating just 4 or 5 key windows with this crude paraffin-soaked cloth reduced radiant heat loss by nearly a quarter during the winter months, and cut the internal summer cooling load by a similar margin. It accomplished the exact same physical result as a professional $400 weather stripping installation, but it used less than $10 worth of raw materials and took an afternoon of simple handwork. I watched an old builder named Eli Stoltzfus prepare these exact wax barriers in his kitchen just outside Intercourse, Pennsylvania. The farmhouse was built by his grandfather in 1889, and the water pipes in the basement had never frozen. Even during the historic winter of 1974, when the thermometer hit 21 below zero, and the modern subdivisions down the road were suffering from burst lines and flooded kitchens. He did not have foam sleeves on his copper lines. He had strips of old muslin sheets, yellowed with age, wrapped tightly around the metal, and sealed with that same cheap wax. It is a slow, methodical process that requires no specialized tools, just a stove, a pot of boiling water, and an understanding of how the material behaves when it transitions from a liquid back to a solid. The entire system relies on patience rather than technology, which brings us to the real question. If a 95-cent block of wax and a piece of scrap fabric can insulate a pipe for 50 years, why are we standing in line at the hardware store, spending hundreds of dollars on synthetic wraps that degrade within a decade? To understand how to actually prepare this material, how to handle the temperature of the melt so the wax penetrates the fib, instead of just sitting on top of it, and exactly where to place it in your house before the season turns, you have to look at the manual method step by step. To make weathercloth that actually works, you have to step away from the modern instinct to speed things up. If you try to rush paraffin, it will either flash into an oily smoke that fills your kitchen, or it will cool too quickly, leaving you with a stiff, brittle sheet of fabric that cracks the moment you try to fold it into a window gap. The old-timers never used a direct flame for this. They used the gentle, indirect heat of a double boiler, which keeps the wax exactly where it needs to be. Just past its melting point, around 140 degrees Fahrenheit, stop and think about the material you are using. You want an old, worn-out cotton bedsheet or a piece of unbleached muslin. Do not use synthetic blends, polyester, or high thread count sheets. The synthetic fibers cannot absorb the wax. The paraffin will simply coat the surface like a slick layer of plastic and peel off later. You want cotton that has been washed dozens of times, where the fibers are relaxed, fuzzy, and open. When you hold it up to the light, you should see a loose, uniform grid. That grid is what will hold the wax. First, take your fabric and cut it into strips. If you are sealing old double-hung windows, cut the strips 3 inches wide and long enough to cover the entire length of the sash. If you are wrapping an exposed waterline in a cold crawl space, make them 4 inches wide and about 3 feet long. Shake out the loose threads from the edges. Now, set up your workspace. You will need an old pot filled with 2 inches of water and a clean, empty coffee can or a smaller metal tin to place inside it. Put 2 blocks of the white paraffin into the tin. As the water begins to simmer, you will hear a faint, rhythmic clicking as the solid blocks move against the metal. Watch it closely. The white, opaque blocks will slowly begin to soften at the edges, turning into a liquid that is as clear and colorless as spring water. You will notice a faint, clean, sweet smell, like an old library book or a freshly snuffed candle. That is the smell of the oil releasing from the wax. Here is the first mistake almost every beginner makes. They dip the cloth into the wax while it is still half melted, or they pull the pot off the stove too soon. If the wax is not fully liquid and hot enough to be fluid, like water, it will not penetrate the core of the cotton thread. It will just sit on the surface like cold grease. When the paraffin is entirely clear, take your first strip of cotton. Hold it by the corners and lower it slowly into the liquid wax. You will hear a tiny, soft hissing sound as the air trapped inside the weave escapes. Use a clean wooden stick. A piece of scrap kindling works perfectly to push the fabric down until it is completely submerged. Let it sit in that hot bath for a full 60 seconds. You want the cotton to literally drink the wax. The fabric will change color right before your eyes. If it was white, it will turn a deep, translucent gray-yellow, like wet parchment. When you pull the strip out using your wooden stick, do not wring it out with your hands. The wax is hot enough to scald you, and if you squeeze it, you will strip away the very barrier you are trying to create. Instead, lift it vertically over the tin and let the excess liquid drain back into the pot for 5 seconds. It should stream off the bottom corner in thin, glass-like threads. While it is still warm and limber, hand the strip to someone else, or carry it immediately to a clothesline stretched across a porch or a basement. Pin it by the very edge. Within 30 seconds, the magic happens. The clear liquid will suddenly turn cloudy, starting from the edges and moving inward. The fabric will stiffen, shifting from a wet, floppy rag into a crisp, smooth sheet that holds its shape like heavy drafting paper. When you touch it, it should not feel sticky or greasy. It should feel smooth, cool, and clean, like the surface of a polished apple. If your cloth feels thick, lumpy, or leaves a white residue on your fingers when you scratch it, the wax was too cold when you dipped it. Do not throw it away. Just drop it back into the hot boiler and let the excess drain off properly. Once the strips are cool and dry, which takes less than 10 minutes, they are ready to be applied. Let us start with the windows, because that is where your immediate heating or cooling loss is happening. Open the lower sash of your window about 6 inches. Take one of your 3-inch weathercloth strips and fold it lengthwise into a long V shape. The wax makes the fabric hold this crease perfectly without ironing. Tuck the point of that V right into the channel where the window sash slides up and down. Push it in using a dull putty knife or even the edge of an old wooden ruler. Now close the window firmly down on top of the strip. The weight of the wooden sash will compress the waxed cloth, molding it into the exact shape of the gap. Because the paraffin is slightly pliable, it fills every microscopic irregularity in the old wood, stopping the wind from whistling through. Yet, because it is still cotton at its core, the window will not stick. You can open it tomorrow morning with a firm tug if you need to breathe the outside air. For the water pipes in your basement or crawl space, the application is slightly different, but even simpler. Start at one end of the exposed copper or iron line. Take a 4-inch strip of the weathercloth and begin wrapping it around the pipe at an angle, overlapping each turn by 2 inches, just like the grip on a leather tool handle or a bicycle handlebar. As you wrap, pull the cloth taut. The wax-on-wax friction will cause the layers to cling to each other and to the cold metal without any glue, tape, or twine. When you reach the end of a strip, simply smooth it down with the palm of your hand. The warmth of your skin is enough to soften the paraffin, just enough to fuse the seam closed. This creates a continuous, seamless jacket of dead air and waterproof fabric around the metal. Cold air moving through the floor, joists cannot touch the pipe, and the moisture that causes summer sweating and winter freezing cannot form on the surface. This is the exact method Eli used. It is quiet, it is simple, and it requires no tools that you cannot find in a kitchen drawer. But there is a specific rhythm to installing this across a whole house, an order that determines whether you are actually balancing the air movement or just shifting the drafts to another room. To understand why this simple combination of old cloth and paraffin wax can match the performance of expensive modern synthetics, you have to look at the physics of how heat and moisture actually behave in a home. It is not magic, and it is not a rural superstition. It is fluid dynamics and thermal resistance, stripped of the corporate jargon that is usually used to sell you things you do not need. Let us break down the science into a simple analogy. Think of your house during a cold winter or a hot summer as a person standing in a sharp wind. If that person puts on a heavy, loose-knit wool sweater, they will still feel the chill because the moving air blows right through the gaps in the yarn. The wool provides insulation, but it has no windbreak. If they put on a stiff rubber raincoat instead, they will stop the wind, but within 20 minutes, they will be soaked through with their own sweat because the rubber cannot breathe. The paraffin-treated weather cloth acts exactly like a high-quality oilskin jacket. At a microscopic level, the cotton fabric provides a flexible structural matrix, a skeleton. Left alone, that skeleton is full of large holes. When you submerge it in hot liquid paraffin, the wax fills the vast majority of those voids, hardening into a semi-solid barrier. This barrier completely stops convective airflow, which is just a technical term for the physical movement of wind or air currents pushing through a crack. Because the air cannot physically push through the wax, the draft stops dead. However, paraffin wax is a long-chain hydrocarbon. While it is completely hydrophobic, meaning it repels liquid water like a duck's feathers, it remains slightly permeable to water vapor at a molecular level when applied in a thin layer over a flexible fiber. This means your house can still shed its internal moisture. When you boil water for pasta or take a hot shower, that humidity needs to escape. If it gets trapped behind synthetic polyurethane foam or non-breathable plastic films, it condenses on the cold wooden framing, creating a breeding ground for rot and structural decay. The weather cloth allows that vapor to pass through in microscopic amounts, maintaining the health of an old wooden structure while completely blocking the cold air currents. Now, let us look at the pipe wrapping. When you wrap a cold water line in this wax cloth, you are creating a series of dead air spaces. Air that cannot move is one of the finest natural insulators on Earth. By overlapping the layers by 2 inches, you are trapping a thin, continuous spiral of still air against the metal pipe, sealed inside a waterproof skin. This stops radiant heat loss from the water inside the pipe, and more importantly, it prevents ambient humidity from condensing onto the cold metal. It is often the constant dampness of condensation, followed by a sudden drop in temperature, that causes a pipe to freeze and burst. Eliminate the moisture and the moving air, and you protect the line. But let us be completely honest about the limitations of this method. I am not here to tell you that a 95-cent block of wax will solve every structural issue in every modern building. It won't, and trying to force it to do so is a recipe for disappointment. First, this method is strictly limited by temperature. Paraffin wax has a melting point between 120 and 150 degrees Fahrenheit. It begins to soften and become structurally weak around 105 degrees. This means you cannot use weather cloth on or near heat sources. Never apply it to steam pipes, radiator lines, wood stove flues, or hot water supply lines coming directly out of a water heater. If you do, the wax will melt, drip onto the floor, and create a serious slip or fire hazard. It is strictly for cold water main lines, crawl space pipes, and window frames. Second, consider the environment where you are placing it. Paraffin is an organic compound. While it repels water, it can catch dust and airborne particles over time. If you use it in a wood shop or a high-dust barn environment, the surface will eventually become dark and fuzzy. It doesn't change the performance, but it will not look clean. Third, let us talk about the limitations of the structure itself. This system works beautifully on wood, plaster, brick, and early drywall. The natural texture of these traditional materials gives the wax cloth something to grip against. However, if your home features modern smooth vinyl windows, high-gloss powder-coated aluminum frames, or slick acrylic surfaces, the weather cloth will not seal correctly. The wax needs a microscopic amount of surface friction to hold its position when compressed. On polished plastic or slick metal sashes, the strip will simply slide out of place when you operate the window. Finally, understand that this is a seasonal maintenance solution, not a permanent structural alteration. A proper wax cloth window seal will easily last through a brutal winter or a scorching summer. But when the season changes and you begin opening and closing those windows daily, the constant mechanical friction will eventually wear down the thin wax coating, causing the cotton to fray. In the traditional cycle of self-sufficiency, these strips are pulled out in the spring, stored in a cool tin box in the cellar, and touched up with a quick dip in the double boiler before being reinstalled late the following autumn. If you are looking for a set-it-and-forget-it solution that you can install once and ignore for 40 years while you watch television, this is not it. This method requires you to participate in the maintenance of your own home. It requires you to watch the weather, to understand how the wind hits your specific plot of land, and to spend an afternoon preparing your structure for the seasons, just as your great-grandfather did. It trades a small amount of your time and attention for absolute independence from the commercial repair industry. Once you accept these boundaries, once you know exactly where the method holds strong and where it fails, you can begin to look at the entire layout of your home differently, mapping out the specific zones where this traditional knowledge can be applied before the next major cold front or heat wave hits your region. The story of this simple combination of cotton and wax does not begin in a corporate laboratory or a modern research park. It belongs to a lineage of practical chemistry that was developed out of absolute necessity on the maritime frontier and the early American homestead, long before paraffin became a common byproduct of the oil refining process. In the mid-19th century, sailors and deep-sea fishermen were coating heavy canvas sails and heavy cotton coats with animal fats, linseed oil, and beeswax to create foul-weather gear. They called it oilskin, and it was the only thing that kept a watchman dry and warm during a 3-month gale in the North Atlantic. When refined paraffin wax became widely available in rural general stores in the 1860s, resource-poor families in the Appalachian Hills and the plains of the Midwest recognized its unique properties immediately. It was cheaper than beeswax, completely odorless compared to tallow or lard, and it did not turn rancid or attract rodents in a dark cellar. Old Order communities, particularly the German and Swiss settlers who populated Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, took this maritime technology and brought it indoors. They realized that the same barrier that could keep sea spray out of a captain's coat could keep a freezing north wind out of a child's bedroom. By the turn of the 20th century, the practice of making weathercloth was standard household knowledge across rural America, passed down from mother to daughter, from master's builder to apprentice. It was recorded in handwritten household ledgers and local grange manuals. But like so many of our most resilient traditions, It was nearly erased by the industrial rush of the post-war era, when central coal furnaces were replaced by cheap, automated oil burners, and electricity began pumping into every valley. The structural efficiency of the house itself ceased to matter to the average consumer. If a house was drafty, you did not fix the draft. You simply turned the thermostat up another notch. The resource was cheap, the anxiety was low, and the old knowledge was quietly buried under a mountain of utility bills. Yet, when the nation faced moments of extreme crisis, the government itself had to dig up these forgotten solutions. As I mentioned earlier, the 1943 War Department Civilian Supply Document, titled the Emergency Household Conservation Manual, was born out of a stark realization. The modern, centralized infrastructure we rely on is incredibly fragile. When the requirements of a wartime economy rationed copper pipes, restricted rubber manufacturing, and redirected fuel oil to the North Atlantic fleets, suburban neighborhoods were suddenly left vulnerable. The War Department did not suggest citizens buy expensive new appliances or hire contractors. They looked back to the methods that had kept pre-industrial families alive for generations, explicitly recommending the saturation of scrap fabrics with plain paraffin wax to insulate exposed household infrastructure and stop the heat loss through leaky window sashes. If you want further confirmation that this is not just folklore, you can find it in the public archives of our land-grant universities. In the late 1970s, during the height of the global energy crisis, the Pennsylvania State University Agricultural Extension Service set out to verify these historical methods. In their 1979 Extension Bulletin on Residential Energy Conservation, researchers conducted controlled thermal tests on 19th-century structures. They documented that applying a simple, low-cost wax and cotton barrier to traditional double-hung windows achieved a level of draft reduction that was statistically indistinguishable from professional synthetic weatherization systems of the era. The report noted that the flexibility of the wax allowed it to conform to the natural warping of seasonal timber in a way that rigid commercial gaskets never could. This is the documentation that has been sitting on the shelves of university libraries and government archives, untouched for decades. It was pushed aside because a 95-cent block of wax does not generate a quarterly profit statement for an insulation manufacturer. It does not require a subscription. It cannot be branded with a sleek logo, and it cannot be marketed on a television commercial stop. And think about that. A technology that cost our grandfathers pennies, a method that can be performed by a child on a Saturday afternoon using an old bedsheet and a pot of hot water, was replaced by a system of expensive dependencies that leaves you vulnerable to the next supply chain breakdown or utility rate hike. This weekend, I want you to reclaim that independence. Don't wait for the winter wind to start rattling your window panes. And don't wait for a $1,200 repair bill to force your hand. Go to the grocery store or the hardware outlet. Walk past the aisles of flashing electronic gadgets, synthetic foam sprays, and plastic wraps. Find the quiet, dusty corner where they keep the simple blocks of canning wax. Spend the $10. Pull that old cotton sheet out of the bottom linen drawer. The one with the frayed edges that you were going to throw into the rag bin anyway. Set your water to a simmer. Watch the solid white blocks melt down into that crystal clear liquid. Smell the sweet, clean aroma of the wax as it changes form. Dip the cloth, hang it to dry, and feel the smooth apple skin texture of the finished material under your fingers. When you slide that first strip into the channel of your oldest window, or when you wrap that cold water line in your basement, you are doing something far deeper than just saving a few dollars on your utility bill. You are stepping out of a consumer cycle that relies on your helplessness. You are participating in a tradition of quiet self-reliance that has sustained human life through the most brutal seasons our ancestors ever faced. You are proving that real knowledge cannot be permanently suppressed by convenience. and that the simplest solutions are often the ones that stand the longest. The old farmhouse stayed warm because the people inside it knew how to listen to the structure, and they knew how to work with the simple materials the earth provided. The knowledge is still here. It never left. It was just waiting for you to find it. What you do with it now is up to you.